providing you with some foundational information that is related to work on disability inclusion and where it sits within the humanitarian program cycle. As I hope all of you are aware, during 2019, for the 2020 cycle, the humanitarian program cycle underwent some pretty radical changes. And as part of this, we were able to more prominently feature disability inclusion, both visually within the documents, but more importantly, within the substance of the assessments, analysis, planning, and monitoring that comprise the package. So today we are going to shift more towards practical application, starting with a presentation of where and how disability inclusion makes its home within the humanitarian program cycle, what that should look like, followed by some mini case studies that speak to specific challenges or problems that we've heard from individuals who participated in the first module. And talking about how those can be addressed, how they can be overcome. And of course, we leave, or we endeavor to leave ample time for questions and answers and for a dialogue with you towards the end. I believe that's all from my side at this point. If I might hand over to Ahmed and Kristen, if they're ready, we can get started with the first part of the presentation. Over to you guys.
Thank you, Kim, for the introduction. As Kim was saying, we will have our first part today. We will discuss to which extent, which is HNO, HRP. For those who know what is HNO, HRP, or have been working on it, HNO, HRP is a part of humanitarian program cycle. The humanitarian program cycle refers to series of action undertaken by management of collective humanitarian response operation to ensure that there are an accurate humanitarian response. So HNO is referring to humanitarian need overview, and HRP is referring to humanitarian response plan. So if we start with our first HNO, which is the humanitarian need overview, we will see that the document itself that every country should develop if they have a humanitarian response plan. They should have a summary of humanitarian need and key finding. The part one usually is about impact of the crisis and what is kind of humanitarian condition is there. Part two is risk analysis. Part three is about monitoring, and part four is about sectorial analysis. And then they have the annexes. The idea here is that we will go through every section and try to see to which extent we can include disability in this section. So you will have an idea as you have how to do it in module one. Now you will have an idea when we write the document and we will put together the document, how we ensure that disability is represented or included inside this document. So starting with the summary of humanitarian need and key finding, which is usually the most important and first part of HNO, we will have two parts. The key finding that usually describe what is the situation in general and the humanitarian consequence. In key finding, at least we need to ensure that the segregated total number of people in need should be by disability. So whenever we have a person in need number, we should have a desegregation by disability. How many person with disability among this number? And of course, to have more qualitative understanding of concern and priorities of person with disability. In the other side, when it comes to humanitarian consequence, we need to describe the specific or what kind of risk faced by subgroups or population due to disability. As we will see in minutes in other slide, it's very important to detect what kind of risk is specifically facing person with disability with interacting with other kind of factor, and also Not only that, not only the risk, but also the existing capacities and coping mechanism of person's ability, how person's ability is responding to the crisis, what kind of coping mechanisms they are using, and to which extent their capacities is allow them to use negative and positive coping mechanisms. Then we will go to the second part, which is focus in this part is focusing on impact of crisis in humanitarian condition. And if we take the first part with the context of the crisis, we need to describe the key problems that is facing in the context of crisis itself, facing person's ability, how the crisis is impacting differently person's ability. So yes, the crisis will impact everyone in the country, but or in the place of the crisis, but to which extent this impact is impacting different. For example, due to their existing capacity or coping mechanism, they could be affected differently. Also factoring contributing to heighten this risk or increase the risk, and then we should list the priorities and the need from the perspective of person's ability themselves. Nothing about us without us. We should include their perspective, asking them about what kind of priorities they have. Then we have the second part, which is humanitarian consequence and causal factor associated with needs, which is covering the whole population. We need to understand from this whole population who is a person with disability and how we identify them as a subgroup, and also reflect diversity and intersectionality. And this is a very important part because usually in HNO that we have seen in last years, usually this part is neglected. Person with disability is very heterogeneous group. They are very diverse. They have a different type of disability. They have a different gender. They have a different age. They have a different social situation and economical situation. We need to understand this diversity and how this factor is have an intersectionality together. If we focus on that and we try to very fastly asking ourselves how we can do that, we will find that we have three factors that is interacting together to create a specific situation for person with disability. First, the factor is related to disability-related factor, including the barrier that is facing person with disability due to their type of disability. Then we have some sort of contextual factor that is related to the whole population, related to the context or related to the crisis. For example, raising of violence in a specific place, or if there are a flood, or there are some nutritional problem. All that is affecting the whole population, but this is interacting with the disability itself barriers. And then we have a structural inequality related to age. Children with disability is affected by the crisis in different way than women with disabilities, than youth with disability. For example, socioeconomic status. Poor person with disability is affected in different way than rich person with disability, or married or non-married, gender, ethnicity, religious, either they are displaced or non-displaced. All that is interacting together to achieve either increase the risk or decrease the risk according to the situation. And if we are prioritizing population group that is vulnerable, we need to understand these three factors and how they are interacting together in order to understand which kind of group we will prioritize. For example, prioritizing internal displaced person with disability, or prioritizing woman with disability in our work. Then we have another two parts that usually covered in HNO, which is severity of humanitarian needs, and that we should, of course, understand what kind of impact of disability on the consequence, as we said. And then number of persons needs, as we said in the first slide, it needs to be highlighted how many persons with disability will be inside this number, how many persons in need will be a person with disability. So we need to disaggregate this number, and we need to visually represent it. This is the part of impact crisis, but this is not the only part. We have usually some question regarding to how we will estimate the person in need with disability. Usually in this situation, the first answer that if you have a primary data collection that you will collect to understand the need and the number of person in need in your crisis area, it's very important to ensure that you use some methods to identify person with disability within this group. And we usually advise to use Washington Group set of tools. And in principle, any data that you will collect should be disaggregated by age, gender, and disability. This is very important to ensure that you have a deep understanding of the group that you will serve. Then if you will not have a primary data collection in, for example, in COVID-19 situation, some country or some situation, you will not be able to collect the primary data collection, you should depend on secondary data source to analyze this data. And if not, you should understand that this secondary data should be reliable and evidence-based. That means that you ensure that the secondary data will be used are able to be used and reliable. Only if you don't have second data source or these second data source are not reliable, in this case, you should use the global estimation that have been set by WHO and World Bank, which is 15% of the population is person with disability. However, it's very important to remember that in humanitarian context, the number of persons with disability is usually much higher than this global estimation. The global estimation is covering all the developed, and humanitarian context. So you need to understand that in humanitarian context, we should should understand that sometimes the number of persons with disability is much higher. Then in part 2, we will have the risk analysis. Usually the humanitarian need overview is having their own risk analysis to understand the risk in general. In this part, we need to describe the broad risk context that is covering or facing person with disability, and also understand how person with disability, DBO, disability person organization, or organization of person with disability, or person with disabilities themselves understanding this risk and barriers. We will not be able to understand the full picture without asking them how they feel, how they see the barriers, how they see the risk. Then in part 3, which is about monitoring of situation and need, of course, we need to understand how this consequence may evolve to person with disability. When we are doing the data analysis or data gathering, sometimes the situation is stable, but we need to understand how the situation could evolve, and when the situation will evolve, how this will affect person with disability. Also, we need to consideration about access to assistance, to which extent the person with disability will be able to access to assistance in the future. And of course, we need to reflect the consultation that we will do with the person with disability and their representative organization. Of course, any question, please send it in the chat. And of course, we will have a time at the end for question and answer. So in the fourth part, which is sectorial analysis, it's very important to understand and describe two things. First, how the crisis impact differently on person with disability. So if you, for example, if you are talking about the education sector, WASH sector, protection sector, any other sector, you need to understand from the point of view of this sector or this cluster, how the crisis impact person with disability in different way. And what kind of factor contributing to increase this risk for person with disability. I will give an example that we have seen in the last year at the humanitarian need overview. Some country, for example, in their HNO or some cluster in their HNO part, they are saying, for example, writing that person with disability are more exposed in situation of insecurity. This kind of, yes, you now acknowledge person with disability, you are acknowledging that they are vulnerable, but this sentence itself have no meaning. It could not be translated to action. So we usually suggest to reformulate it to making it more concrete, and so it's easy to be translated to action. For example, instead of saying that, we could say that in a situation of insecurity, persons with disability are in heightened risk of experience violence due to their difficulty in fleeing to safe area or run to the safe area. So it's not only important to understand what kind of risk that person with disability is exposed to, but also to understand the cause, the factor that is leading to that. In this case, that there an inability to run or to fleeing in safe area. This is one example. Of course, you have several other examples, but for the time's sake, we will contain. So, and then we have the annex, which is the last part of the HNO part. And usually we need here to understand that in most of the time, we will have information gaps. And even if you have an information gaps and we accept that sometime because of the lack of information or because we are unable to collect it, it's very important to acknowledge this information gap. So we need in the annex to say how many or how much information we need to collect more to make our programming much stronger, what kind of reliable data that we need, and how we can integrate this in the coming cycle of need assessment to enable to collect the data that we need. And in which situation we will need a detected primary data collection exercise that is focusing on personal disability, similar to what happened, for example, in Somalia and in Afghanistan. Sometimes we have a dedicated primary data collection for disability in very rare area in our situation. And then we need to also reference to local disability actor that could be an added value from the quantitative and qualitative data collection point of view. Then we will move to the, I will move now to my colleague, Kristen, to cover the humanitarian response plan.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to be here. I just wanted to check that you can hear me okay, that the volume is fine. Ahmed, is the volume okay at your end?
All good, Kirsten.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So as Ahmed mentioned, I'll be speaking about the humanitarian response plan and where and how disability can concretely be reflected in the HRP. What we've found in reviewing HNOs HRPs is that quite often the very good analysis that's been done at the HNO stage is not always reflected in the HRP. So I'll be speaking about how that can be better strengthened and also sharing some of the learning we've had from the really good how disability has been included in HRPs. So on to the next slide, yes. So firstly, starting right from the beginning of the HRP, right at the start in the forward from the humanitarian coordinator, there's a really good opportunity for us to already strengthen disability inclusion from the start. What we've found in our conversations with country teams is that leadership in the humanitarian country team is particularly important in terms of promoting disability inclusion in humanitarian programming. So what we really strongly recommend is that there's advocacy for disability to be explicitly referenced in the statement from the forward by the humanitarian coordinator. And then in the humanitarian response plan at a glance, Ahmed has already spoken with us about the importance of having the PIN figure, the persons in need figure, disaggregated by disability. And so just a reminder again that is a really important step to take. Next slide. So in terms of the strategic humanitarian priorities, Ahmed mentioned persons with disabilities as a subgroup. And so I just wanted to emphasize that again. We really do strongly recommend that persons with disabilities are recognized as a prioritized subgroup. And this is in recognition of the fact that we know that there will be people with disabilities among all populations in all types of emergencies, and they will always be differently impacted. And generally more negatively, disproportionately impacted by the emergency. However, while we do recommend strongly that persons with disabilities are recognised as a prioritised subgroup, we also strongly recommend that this recognition goes beyond general statements such as persons with disabilities will be prioritised or vulnerable groups will be prioritised. There's a really good opportunity here for the HRP to really describe concretely how the crisis impacts differently on persons with disabilities. So for example, capturing the priorities and needs from their perspective. considering disability-related dimensions of vulnerability. So what are the factors that contribute to the risks faced by persons with disabilities? And of course, a summary of the identified barriers to their inclusion. And what we've seen as a good practice coming out in a number of HRPs is a specific text box that provides a space for a bit more detail on the situation of persons with disabilities and how they will be included in the response. But that text box doesn't necessarily have to be specifically on persons with disabilities. What we've seen in a number of HRPs are text boxes, say, for age, gender, and disability, again reflecting intersectionality, as Ahmed spoke about, or reaching the furthest behind. We've found that this really provides an important space for more detailed reflection on how to include persons with disabilities. Now, in terms of strategic priorities, this slide just sets out in a very summarised form. And again, I would encourage all of you to have a look at the guidance which addresses this in much more detail. But we do recommend that disability is reflected in the strategic priorities in various ways. And just maybe 2 points to highlight here is that we would recommend to avoid focusing solely on one dimension of need. So for example, health. Avoid focusing solely on that one dimension. And also to, again, avoid being too general. So avoiding those general statements like we will prioritise vulnerable groups. Instead, what we would recommend here is, for example, addressing how the impacts of social inclusion or marginalisation due to disability-related discrimination, or identifying the obstacles to accessing humanitarian assistance. And these obstacles can either be within the broader environment or they can be related to the design of the humanitarian assistance itself. Sorry, yeah. And also to set out here, the heightened risk, another element that can be reflected is the heightened risk faced by persons with disabilities of violence, exploitation and abuse. And that can include gender-based violence, but also disability-related violence. Now, in this next slide here, we talk about the strategic objectives. We generally do not recommend a strategic objective specifically on persons with disabilities. However, disability can be reflected across the description of all of the strategic objectives. And you may also want to consider having a specific strategic objective that where the situation of persons with disabilities can be better highlighted. So this can be, for example, a strategic objective on quality, or on inclusion, or on reaching the furthest left behind. We have a really great example here from Somalia. I won't go through it in detail because you will be able to have a look at this slide when we share it with you afterwards. Onto the next slide. So in terms of response approach and costing, again, you'll see this message keeps coming up consistently throughout our discussion this morning. We really do recommend avoiding this generalization, so avoiding simply listing persons with disabilities or vulnerable groups as a group to be targeted or prioritized. Instead, what we really recommend is that there's a description of how the response will address those specific factors that have contributed to that heightened vulnerability. And that this is done through a twin track approach, which means that the response includes both actions that ensure that everything that is done in the humanitarian response is inclusive of and accessible to persons with disabilities, while at the same time also having these interventions that are specifically targeted to persons with disabilities and following both of those tracks. So perhaps to give a really simple example from gender-based violence, if, for example, at the needs assessment phase, it's identified that women and girls are at heightened risk, women and girls with disabilities are at heightened risk of GBV because the reporting mechanisms are not accessible to them, for example. Then in this case, in the response approach, what would really be highlighted is actions to address that particular barrier that was identified. And following a twin track approach, that could be, for example, in terms of mainstreaming, improving accessibility of reporting mechanisms. And in terms of targeted actions, it could be targeted outreach to persons with disabilities through local DPOs, for example. Now, there's a whole lot on this slide on part 3, monitoring and accountability. sorry, Ahmed, yeah, on monitoring and accountability, because this is a really important area where we can really ensure that we're keeping track of how persons with disabilities are being included and using that information to inform the response going forward. So a few points to highlight here. Firstly, there's a really good opportunity to explicitly recognise where there are barriers, where there are gaps in the collection of data on persons with disabilities, and that then places you in a good position to be able to strengthen that collection in the following round of the HPC. Secondly, it's really important to describe how mechanisms for feedback and complaints can be made accessible to persons with disabilities. We're increasingly seeing in HRPs these broad references to ensuring accessibility of feedback and complaints mechanisms, which is great. And what we would really encourage is that there may be some specificity around this. So for example, emphasising that there will be multiple mechanisms for feedback and complaints so that people with different impairment types are able to do that safely. Now, in terms of indicators, there's a lot we can say on this, so I'll just be very brief and encourage you to read more detail in the guidance. But basically, we would again encourage you to follow a twin track approach here by having both indicators disaggregated by disability in addition to disability specific indicators. And what we really see is that those disaggregated indicators are important for capturing access to mainstream assistance, while those disability specific indicators are really important for capturing the provision of more disability specific assistance. So maybe just a very brief example from education. So in terms of disaggregated indicators, we would recommend, for example, that the number of children accessing schools, that figure is disaggregated by disability. And if, for example, you have a PIN figure, excuse me, you have a PIN figure of 10% of children have disabilities, but when you're then monitoring access to education and you find that only 3% of children in school have disabilities, then that is clearly flagging an issue that would then need to be looked into. And in terms of a disability specific indicator in terms of education, this could be, for example, number of children with disabilities reached with assistive technology. Yes, onto the next slide. In terms of sectoral objectives and responses, I won't say much here because everything we've set up until this point also applies in terms of the sectoral objectives and responses. But just to really highlight that disability inclusion is very much a cross-cutting issue and should not only be addressed in, say, the health or protection sector, but really needs to be addressed across all of the sectors. Next slide. So in terms of, there's also space in the HRP annexes to reflect disability inclusion. So we've already mentioned previously that there's a good opportunity to highlight the need to strengthen collection and use of data on persons with disabilities to really place you in a good position to have some focus on that going forward. In terms of the costing methodology, this is a difficult issue, but it is important also to highlight the financial requirements for inclusion. And this is really part of quality programming. Now, what we see sometimes is the importance for budgeting on disability-specific initiatives, such as assistive technology. What we see less often, but is particularly important, is budgeting for accessibility. So how do we ensure that our wash facilities are accessible, nutrition programming is inclusive, etc. Now, in terms of advocacy with donors, there's also a really good opportunity to highlight disability under the section on what if we fail to respond. So really emphasising that without this dedicated resourcing for inclusion, those most at-risk populations will not be reached and will be placed at heightened risk. Next slide. And so I'll just wrap up here. You've been listening to us for quite some time, so I think it's good for us to go into a more interactive component. But just to really finish off by highlighting that what we've really tried to communicate during this first section here is that disability inclusion, it's not something separate or special that is done in parallel to the HPC. It's really something that is integrated at every phase of the HPC. And again, the guidance that has been shared with you, and we can share again afterwards, can provide you with much more detail on how that can be done. Back to you, Kim. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you, Kirsten and Ahmed. Just a couple of notes from the chat. A few of you had been asking about disaggregation of disability statistics by age, by sex, with specifically a number of questions on children of different age ranges. So Steve did share a number of resources that will provide some insights to that. Just do click through the chat and you will find those. And one question that I noticed, which maybe if my UNICEF and UNHCR colleagues are all right, we could address, because I think it references some of the presentation as well. And if I'm jumping the gun, please let me know. Why do we need persons with disabilities actors as references? You know, this does link to one of the scenarios, so so perhaps I'll throw that question out there and have it plant a seed in your minds for you to consider for discussion as part of one of the scenarios that are forthcoming. With that, I believe it is Steve who is going to engage you with the first scenario, where you'll be asked to answer some questions and see how we can problem solve some resolutions. Over to you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. My name's Steve Perry. I work with UNICEF in Geneva. Great to meet everybody. What I'm going to do is introduce the first of two scenarios, and the purpose of these scenarios is to get you as individuals to begin to think through some of the things that we've been talking about. So let me first describe scenario one, what context we're going to put you into, and then I'll describe a short exercise that we can do as individuals. So in scenario one, we want you to think about strengthening the collection and analysis of data on disability in this fictional country that seems to be close to Italy called Ruritania. And they're working on their HNO HRP in the current humanitarian program cycle, and let's give them some help. So Ruritania, this fictional country, is on a positive trajectory towards peace and stability after years and years of conflict. Nevertheless, it's got problems. It's still hampered by cyclical recurrences of climatic shocks. There's continued pockets of conflict. It continues to be kind of an insecure environment, and there's still a lot of displacement, all compounded by political and socioeconomic instability. And along comes COVID-19, which throws another curveball into the mix. I'm gonna go down one, Ahmed. So this creates a really complex environment where persons with disabilities face a lot of additional barriers and risks. We imagine they're very often excluded from humanitarian assistance due to pre-existing discrimination that might exist, stigma, societal exclusion, and so on. And given these factors and the extreme levels of poverty that we're still seeing experienced by persons with disabilities, it's really important for us as humanitarian actors to identify persons with disabilities as a group, as a high-risk group based on data and evidence, rather than just sort of assuming what the situation is or coming up with anecdotal evidence. So the humanitarian coordinator in Ruritania has committed to strengthening information on disability during the current 2021 HPC. But the HPC process has been set back by COVID-19. We have issues of social distancing that we have to respect. Can we go down one slide? So what we would like you to do in scenario one is to help the HCT take a decision. A quality humanitarian response is built on an understanding of the requirements and priorities of persons with disabilities during a crisis. How can we ensure that there are accurate and meaningful information in place and data about disability during the HNO process. So I want you guys as a group individually to think through what the consequences are. So what I'd like you to do is to click on the link that you will see in the chat, I believe, Ahmed, is that right? And that link will take you to a Google Doc, and it will describe the things that I've just said, and it will give you an option to choose one of the three scenario choices. One scenario choice has to do with doing a primary data collection exercise. The second option has to do with using existing secondary information that might be available. And option 3 would be to just use the default of the 15% global estimate. And as you click through the options and you see what the possible consequences are of the three ways of going, I want you as individuals to settle on which of the three options you think is the best. Click that one and then click proceed, and that'll give us a kind of proportion of the world out there, the group that's participating in this training, what you think the best direction should be. So what you're seeing on the screen is the Google Doc that you will see when you click through. You see the three little dots. If you click on a dot, click on option 1 for me, Ahmed. Yeah, you're getting close. Yeah. And then you click next. It tells you what possible consequences there are. This, you know, when you go out and do a new primary data collection, it means that you'll have disaggregated data. It also means that you'll be able to match that demographic data together with other sectoral information that comes out of the survey. But it probably also means that you'll have to throw more resources at the problem. If this is the choice that you would like to make, you know, press submit and then you're done, or press back and you can go and see what the consequences of the other two options are. Let's press back there, yeah. And if this time you change the dot to option 2, you would see what the consequences are for option 2. Press next. There you go. You know, option 2 is that you use the existing data that might be available in the context in Ruritania, and you see that there are several consequences to that. So read through those, and if you feel that those you can live with those consequences, press submit or press back and see what the option 3 is. Option 3 is let's go with the WHO's figure. We all trust WHO all the time, so let's see what the consequences are there. Yeah, and if you see the 3 dots, you know, there is a global estimate. It doesn't necessarily reflect what is exactly going on in Ruritania, so it might not be as accurate as it could be. We're not talking to any persons with disability when we use a global estimate like this. But the great thing is you don't need many resources. You only just need a calculator to, you know, press 0.15 times whatever the overall persons in need number is. So you see that there are different options. So please click on the link that Ahmed has shared. You'll see in the chat box there is a link to that. We'll give you a few minutes now to go through that, and already you see, you know, the pie chart will grow and change as people submit their choices, and we'll have a chance to talk about it. So let's give the group, what do you say, Ahmed? 3-4 minutes more?
Yes, thank you, Steve.
Kim, you were promising to fill in the white noise.
I was giving them a minute to read there.
So we have something like 96 participants, which is fantastic. And so far 21 have put in their responses. So let's see when that number sort of begins to level off, and then we can talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a preference here already.
Yeah, that blue slice of the pie is really, really big, isn't it?
Everyone loves a good primary data collection exercise. Steve, what I really like about your scenario, or this scenario, is that there is truly not one perfect answer. You know, for each country, it's a different situation. And of course, in an ideal world, we would have the time, the resources, and the ability to gain access to very precise and robust data sets. But the reality is we don't live in that world. So we're constantly having to make difficult decisions on how we can get the best information available given the time and the resources we have. And I feel like this very much speaks to that realistic issue that we all grapple with.
Yeah, it's a super point. And as we drill down into this, I mean, we've offered some of the consequences to each of these choices, of course, but there's probably a lot other consequences in addition. One is probably just the makeup of the humanitarian country team and what their priorities and workloads are. Right? And so doing fresh data collection sometimes is always a great option, of course, but you know, they're often competing priorities. So we're up to 35 responses out of 90 that have answered.
Come on, guys, are you mulling over the different options and taking very seriously the decision that you make on this scenario? Steve, I know a few people in the chat had said that internet connectivity was having an adverse effect on their ability to complete this survey.
Okay. So we can talk a little bit about it before moving on to the second scenario, and I think Ricardo, you're gonna pull the rope on that one. But when we look at so what I'm seeing here is over around 70% of you feel that the best option of the three is to collect new primary data. And there are lots of reasons why that's a really great choice. When you do that and you use the Washington Group questions or another internationally recognized way of producing consistent results, what you get is a kind of data set that you can correlate with lots of other factors. For example, if you have a disability disaggregated data set and you also have information on, say, the WASH sector or participation in education and emergencies or something like that, you can disaggregate that by, you can understand how participation looks in considering disability. And that can give programmers really a good insight in terms of how to better design their programs. One of the issues, though, especially in COVID times, is it might be less easy to collect fresh household information without clever methodologies for doing that. If there are social distancing requirements, maybe you have to use telephones to do your surveying, and that creates a kind of barrier or limits access to some persons with disabilities if they don't have access to telephones, or if they can't hear what's going on, it may exclude people inadvertently. The second option number 2, which was the choice of about 20% of you, was to fill in the gaps with robust secondary data. And that's a great choice too in settings where you do have some secondary data to draw on. There's a lot of caveats, and go to the guidance to read a discussion on some of the things to be careful about. You still need to figure out how to use that data that is available. So it's important to take the step of preparing a data analysis plan, of course. The secondary data that may be available may actually underestimate the situation, though. It depends who has collected the secondary data and how and when. And it's possible that that might not be the best reflection of what's going on. Especially if that secondary data, consider a situation where the only secondary data that you have is a pre-conflict data set. for example, something that the government in Syria had collected prior to the conflict. Well, you know, the conflict has been going on for years and the situation has changed a lot. So one of the real important factors to look at with secondary data is sort of when it was collected and how relevant it remains. Now, option number three, there is no right answer to these three. Option number three was the choice of about 11%. You know, and option number three is, in a sense, the default approach, where you say, well, globally, we have an understanding that there's about 15% of the world's population that are disabled, and we can use that as a good starting point for our understanding of the situation, with a couple of caveats, of course. I mean, there's fewer children who are disabled. UNICEF estimates that it's about 10% of children as a group who are disabled, and older people are more disabled. So as a whole population, it's 15%. But if you're just looking at older people, the proportion of people who are disabled would be higher. And if you just look at children, it would be a bit lower. The other couple of issues with using the 15% estimate, one is that it unfairly, in a way, it makes it too easy for us in a way. By just sort of using a 15% estimate. It means that we don't need to go outside the office. We just plug in a number. And that means that we're not really being cognizant of the needs, views, and priorities of persons with disabilities in a way that we could have been had we collected, you know, fresher data. It also doesn't necessarily shed any light on particular programming factors. There might be more people than 15% that are impacted. There might be more than 15% that have issues with WASH, or more than 15% that have, you know, particular health issues or other sectoral needs. But the good thing about using option number three, of course, is that it's fast. You know, just use the 15%. And in the absence of the other two, it's a good choice. I mean, we wouldn't want people to not put in a number because they felt that using 15% was not a good way of going. So if there are questions that have come out of that, let's talk about them more in the time that we have for question and answer at the end. But at this point, let's turn it over to the second scenario that I think, Ricardo, you're going to help us with.
Thank you, Steve. Just checking that you can hear me right. Can you hear me well?
Yes. Loud and clear.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So this second scenario is about participation. You've been sharing questions already around participation of persons with disabilities. The idea would be that, well, now we are in a closed country. We've called it Mauritania 2, but we could select another one of the map. Spain, for example, and there's a protracted crisis in this context, involving large numbers of displaced populations. Okay, due to this being, can we please go back? Thank you. Due to this being a long-term ongoing war, there has been a high exposure to explosive ordnance, to conflict in itself, low security of roads, low access to nutrition, healthcare, etc. So the proportion, the prevalence of disability in the population is higher than in other contexts. Okay, that would be one of the key issues to consider. Now, given these facts, there is an emergence of a few strong but well-articulated local organizations of persons with disabilities, and there is a strong interest and a good amount of humanitarian funding and an interest in prioritizing programming responding to the needs of persons with disabilities. We can think of contexts already where we have a similar situation where there's a protracted crisis, a strong interest in the humanitarian community, in the international community, so availability of funding, and an interest in having a response to the needs of persons with disabilities. As in many humanitarian contexts, the coordination architecture is two-tiered. There's two layers. One, we have the humanitarian country team as a higher level, involving UN agencies, some donors, and selected NGOs. And then there is an inter-cluster coordination team, which is more technical and involving cluster coordinators and NGOs as colleagues. Now, our assignment, what we would like to do is to involve persons with disabilities in this context. I will just give that we will discuss a bit more the why, as well, seeing what would be your answers. But if we want to do it, how do we engage the persons with disabilities, organizations representing persons with disabilities within this structure? You have a similar exercise. You can link, yeah, that's it. You can click in the link in the chat box, and you will find 3 different options. So each of them will lead you to a consequence, a series of consequences. You have the option 1 would be establishing a permanent seat on the humanitarian country team for a local representative of a person or for organization of persons with disabilities. The second one would be encouraging relevant clusters, and we give examples of health protection to build a stronger relationships with local OPDs. And the third one would be identifying potential OPDs and invest in their longer term capacity strengthening. Again, you select one of those, you will see, you click next, as Ahmed is showing us, and then you will, that's it, we go for one, and you will see that there are consequences, some options, some bullet points on the top side, and you can choose either submitting that because it's your preference, because it speaks to your experience, because it speaks to your context. You can add information as well, or you can go back and just select another option. Okay, you can. We recommend you to go through 3 options to have some of the information there. We give you a few minutes to go through these options and think on your own context, and then we will analyze together the feedback. It's an organization, so answering to Basma, is an organization of persons with disabilities. We will discuss further as well. I would like to first give you time to go through it. But if you are interested, we can as well, we will share resources in the Interagency Standing Committee guidelines on inclusion of persons with disabilities. You can see that organizations of persons with disabilities are representing persons with disabilities. The majority of the board is formed by persons with disabilities, and they engage in advocacy, but in other types of activities as well that we will see when we analyze the results. Okay, we have 9 responses already.
This is great, Ricardo. And one thing I had noticed during the first webinar that we discussed a bit with Steve was the language that was used in this scenario, suggesting that only, what do we mean by relevant clusters?
Exactly.
And I
Yes.
think it was Kirsten who mentioned in her presentation early in today's session that all clusters, of course,
Yes.
are relevant. So it's interesting language to use, and yeah, just noted.
Yes. We will see when we will discuss the results, ahead of trying to bias you with any additional information. We go for 26 responses, and we have almost paired option 1 and option 3, and option 2 being less selected. Okay, we will give 1 additional minute and then we start analyzing. If you didn't select yet, please go ahead. There's a competition between option 1 and option 3, I see. Okay, so I think we've reached 43 responses. Let's start analyzing. First, one interesting question to answer would be, well, what are organizations of persons with disabilities? How do they differ from organizations that work with persons with disabilities that are specialized on disability? The first difference would be that for organizations of persons with disabilities, we particularly refer to organizations where persons with disabilities are in the main governance structure, so they have a self-representing capacity. A second question that we could ask ourselves would be, well, why, right? And I think that I've seen that in the chat box. Well, beyond full and effective participation and inclusion in society being a principle on the conventions on the rights of persons with disabilities, and this may not say much to many of us, but the importance of having this principle outlined and being one of the bases of the convention is that persons with disabilities have been objects of decisions throughout history. We are many times used to see that decisions are taken on their behalf and that there's like top down operational as well decisions or policy development taken in different countries. So the convention wants to address that by asking and actually making accountable member states, but as well service providers, for really involving persons with disabilities within any decision that is going to affect their life. And any decision that we are taking in a humanitarian context may affect the life of persons with disabilities. So that would be a reason. But then there would be an added value as well. Persons with disabilities and their representatives would have information on estimates, national estimates. That was a question that was addressed in the chat. There are places as far as the Pacific Islands where organizations of persons with disabilities have been collecting data and have databases on persons with disabilities. They have many times registers as well of their members, with as well sometimes limitations because there may be not identifying persons who acquire disability, etc. But there would be already a minimum of a register available. They have information as well on services, on policies at national level that would be interesting to consider, or very practical and useful services such as interpreters or access to assistive devices or providers of assistive devices in country, depending on the context that we're working on. Well, just sharing that why. Now, the how. Well, we see that now that I've given a bit more of time, the option of establishing a permanent seat would be the preferred one. As Steve shared, there's no good or wrong answer. It depends on the situation that you're facing and the experience. Some of the issues that we should be considering, though, is that when, for example, in this case, when we are establishing a permanent seat, we could have an overarching influence within the different clusters and within the different operations. However, we could have as well a high risk of tokenism, right? There would be a limited capacity to follow up the amount of information that would be required for that overarching, let's say, requirements or tasks. And in additional, we would need as well to ensure that the participation is meaningful by having organizations of persons with disabilities informed about the cluster system, how it operates, how the different processes are taking place, etc. There is where option 3, which has had a good amount of numbers as well in terms of long-term capacity strengthening, providing support, capacity building to OPDs on how humanitarian action works as a system and the different type of processes, stakeholders involved, programming, etc., would be an interesting area of, let's say, investment for cluster coordination with a vision of a long-term meaningful engagement of persons with disabilities. The second option, as already as well shared by Kim, is many times a preferred option in many countries because it's quicker, because it's more, you can see more immediate results as well. However, there is a risk of living in a corner or isolating, siloing disability related discussions only because we think that there are certain clusters that are more relevant. Usually we have health in terms of rehabilitation, there could be protection, but there could be another of the most common ones are WASH in terms of the accessibility of WASH facilities, etc. There is a high risk though of having that conversation, let's say, siloed, right? So as shared, there's no preferred options. We wanted to share, however, some of the issues that you may need to consider, and that you may have seen as well. Accessibility in terms of communication, language communication is another point, but as well availability of any accommodation that persons with disabilities may require when they are finding that the discussions are not accessible, in terms of well, access to technology, but as well in face-to-face meetings, ensuring that the venue is accessible, that we have interpreters if they are required, or we can support those interpreters if they are identified by persons with disabilities themselves. Okay, so with this, I would like to finish this scenario and open for Q&A and give back the floor to Kim or Ahmed. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ricardo. Very interesting. So we have about 20 minutes left for questions. And we have a couple of questions which we would be interested in hearing your thoughts on. But first, we want to ensure that we address all of the questions that you have. So there was one question in the chat asking about some statements that were made during the first module. And specifically, the question is, why did we recommend that data not be disaggregated by disability? So Kirsten, Ahmed, perhaps I could hand to you to take that question, while I also encourage others to put any questions they may have into the chat box. Over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Kim. Ahmed, I'm happy to make a start if you wanted to add.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, great. So if I've understood the question correctly, during the first webinar, what we did emphasize was that there isn't a need to disaggregate the PIN figure by type of disability or type of functional difficulty. And just to explain a little bit more why we did emphasize that, there's a few different reasons. Firstly, knowing what type of disability a person has or what type of functional difficulty doesn't really tell us so much about what barriers they face to accessing assistance or what their experience is of a humanitarian crisis. So for example, if there are two people who are blind, who are not able to see, excuse me, One of them may have very recently acquired their impairment, another one may have been born with their impairment. Those two people are going to have very, very different experiences and face different barriers. So that's the first reason, just because it doesn't tell us everything we need to know. Secondly, we know that in any population, there will be people with all different types of functional difficulties, and we need to ensure that all the assistance we provide addresses barriers faced by people with all those different types of functional difficulties. And we don't necessarily need to know how many people in the population have difficulty seeing or walking, etc. Because regardless of the numbers, we do need to ensure that assistance is accessible. However, and going back to thinking about why we need to have that disaggregated PIN figure, one key reason is to flag where there are barriers to accessing assistance. So for example, going back to the example I gave about education, if we know 10% of the population of children has a disability, but only 3% of the school population has a disability, it really flags that there's a gap in access to education. However, where it may be more useful and interesting to look at what types of functional difficulties people have is where there has been this flag of, okay, there's a gap here. There's a substantial number of persons with disabilities who are not accessing assistance. And then going back and doing a bit more detailed analysis of who those people are. What type of functional difficulties do they have? What type of barriers are they facing? Why are they not getting access? So it's at that more detailed level of analysis that it may be useful to have that information. However, it's not required for the PIN figure for that reason. Not sure if that's clear. Perhaps Ahmed or Steve can help to clarify.
Thank you, Kristen. I think it's a very comprehensive answer. And just to summarize, what we have said in the last webinar is regarding the PIN number. So you always ask yourself, if I will disaggregate it by type or difficulty, by type of disability or difficulty, according where is the number is. When we are talking about PIN, it's only disability. When you open the HNO, you will see the PIN number disaggregated by gender, by age, by disability as a one number, and that's it. This is our recommendation. However, for example, when you are talking about situation in a specific sector, or you are talking about response, or you are talking about number that is will lead to action, of course, you can have more disaggregation, what we called it sub-disaggregation. That means that you have a disaggregation for person with disability, and then you have a sub-disaggregation for by type of disability, or by gender, or by difficulty according to the number. So it's about the reporting, where is the number placed in the HNO, HRP, and according to that you choose your best effective way of disaggregation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Now, there was another question that came in while we were discussing the point, and it is, should OPDs be involved in the sector analysis? And I think the question speaks more broadly to at what points, or what are the most critical points at which OPDs should be involved in the humanitarian needs overview, the joint intersectoral analysis, recognizing that organizations can perhaps be relatively small and may not have the resources to attend every cluster or sector meeting and every intersectoral meeting. So recognizing that we all have to improve our efficiencies. What in your sense, either Ricardo or Ahmed or Steve, maybe I'll throw this one to you, Ahmed. Would you feel are the most critical places where OPDs can have the greatest influence over the analysis that feeds into the HNO? Over to you.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you for the question. It's a very important question. Short answer: whenever you will consult the population, you should consider consulting also person with disability and DBO. This is one. However, you need some time to consult the DBO and person with disability even more than all the population, because we know that even in the case of COVID-19 and the fact that there are always lack of secondary data and the primary data of person with disability, we will need to understand the situation of person with disability. So we can substitute the lack of data, either secondary or primary, by consulting persons with disability and ask them about what we called it qualitative data. That means that data is related to the barrier that they are faced, related to the problem that they are faced, related to the coping mechanisms that they are usually used, and of course their opinion and priorities regarding. So specifically in the process itself, in HNO, when you are putting your analysis question, you can consult with them, but this is an optional. However, when you answer this question, we started to answer the analysis question that you put it in the HNO, it's definitely very important to consult with them. When you are asking about the priorities, you should consult with them. When you are designing your response, you should consult with them. So it's very important to do that in a regular situation. And also, if you are trying to reach to a specific person's disability on the community, it's very important to reach to DBO sometime, because they can help you to reach to the population of persons with disability on the community. Ricardo or Steve, do you have an added on?
Hi, Ahmed. Thanks. I was just adding on the chat box that, for example, in the design as well of primary data collection efforts, they can have a technical support capacity to ensure that data collection processes are accessible, developing alternative ways of disseminating information or reaching out in direct surveying, and as well engaging respondents with disabilities. Within the Americas, for example, is happening now with a regional organization of persons with disabilities, just as an example, and related to COVID-19. Over.
Can I add to that? That's great, Ricardo. One of the concerns that I have in the current COVID moment is, as we proceed to do household surveys in different forms, there's a real risk of passing over households or families that have persons with disabilities just because of accessibility issues. And so that's a place where I really see OPDs offering a lot of possibility to access a group of people that are really possibly marginalized at this point in time just because of social distancing requirements. So, you know, back to the question, so OPDs can be really helpful at the needs assessment stage. And as Ricardo, you said, you know, really helpful in terms of the response stage as well. Over.
May I answer perhaps to Melissa in terms of who is best placed to consult OPDs with a key message, and just inviting on having a good coordination. One of the risks that I didn't mention is overwhelming as well organizations of persons with disabilities and instrumentalizing them. I'm going to be very transparent. There will not be a large amount of organizations of persons with disabilities in countries. Sometimes there's many, and we need to see as well which constituencies do they represent. As Christian is sharing with the International Disability Alliance, there has been as well different training efforts to ensure that organizations are representing the voices of different constituencies or disabilities, but there is a risk of, let's say, consulting or multiple actors reaching out to those organizations. So the role of coordinating and having a coordinated engagement with them will be very important, and it depends on country, right? What is the entry point? What is the best entry point? And then what is going to be the most meaningful way, ensuring as well that they are supported to contribute meaningfully. Thank you.
No, that's great, Ricardo. You made a point that I was just about to make as well, and I'll add that Kirsten has added some additional information on that. So Melissa, my supplement to Ricardo's answer is that would vary from country to country, and it's a decision that should probably be taken at the country team level with the ICCG to identify who is best placed to be a key interlocutor. I can say that within the step-by-step guide to the HPC 2021, we do recommend that at key points within the intersectoral analysis process, that DPOs be engaged, if at all possible, to ensure that that lens is being effectively reflected. Not just that we're making an effort to do it, but that we're helping to ensure that we're doing it well. So your question is a very good one, and we appreciate it. Oh my goodness! While I was speaking, our questions blew up here a little bit. Let me just see if we have missed anything. I don't think so. So we had a couple of questions that we'd love to hear your thoughts on, while also getting feedback from the facilitators here today. And one of this Steve started to touch on. So what challenges would you foresee with the use of remote monitoring and ensuring inclusion of persons with disabilities? So Steve, I think since you started to touch on this, perhaps I could throw this one over to you while we see if others have thoughts that they put into the chat box as well. Over to you.
So Kim, the question is, in this uncertain time with social distancing cautions in place, how do we still access data? There is some useful guidance on the Washington Group site in terms of how to use their question set and their guidance at this time, and it's worth sort of going over there to look. Maybe somebody can put the Washington. I think Kirsten, you've already put the Washington Group reference in the chat box. What they caution us during this time is that when you are doing remote monitoring, you sometimes miss some of the visual clues that you would pick up if you were actually in the residence face to face with a household head or other people that you're interviewing, and it's the possible follow-up to probe might be more difficult. Second issue is that if you do remote monitoring, if you phone, there's going to be exclusion errors in terms of who is who has phones, who has access to phones, who can use phones. So that there'd be a range of persons with disabilities that you exclude because of their access to that kind of technology. But what I would urge people to do is to go over to the Washington Group, look at some of their advice and some of their cautions. I think that's a good set of guidance. And I believe, Kirsten, there's been other guidance that has been produced by your groups on interviewing processes, and maybe people can reference those as well. Over.
Great. Now I've posted one, sorry, Steve, I'm having trouble speaking. I've posted one link in the chat box, and I'll have a look at what other guidance we have and share that afterwards as well.
Thanks for that to both of you. So in the absence of any other questions coming through right now, I will throw another one out with the facilitators. So what do you think, or how would you characterize the role of the different clusters, beyond the health and the protection cluster, as we spoke of earlier, in supporting data collection and analysis on disability inclusion? And Ricardo, if it's all right, I might see if you would like to comment on this, because I believe it also feeds off of some of the information that you were providing a bit earlier as well. Can I hand over to you?
So, sorry, can you come back again?
Certainly. So what do you think the role of different clusters is in supporting data collection and analysis on disability inclusion?
Okay, thank you. So the first answer would be following a rights-based approach. It would be as important as it would be for any other demographic factor, right? This is a message that I think couldn't be repeated enough. We've shared with Ahmed that usually data disaggregation efforts need to be disaggregated by sex, age, and disability. Whenever we are considering that demographic factors may have an impact in our programming and in our strategies, then that type of analysis has to be placed in terms of what are the risks, the particular risks that these populations or that how those risks or these situations may impact differently to different populations based on these demographic factors. What are the more dedicated barriers that persons with disabilities are going to be facing, and there we could come to the points on and yes, I think you're going to that slide as well. What are those particular barriers that persons with disabilities will be facing, and then what are the solutions that we're going to put in place? And you will see that in the guidance you have different types of solutions expressed as well with different types of indicators, and there are a series of resources, the IAC guidelines, etc. But that would be the moment. Okay, there would not be, I would say, a particular moment, but whenever age, sex, and disability are considered, and then gender as a social construct, disability as a social construct, including as well barriers to access. Thank you.
That's really helpful, Ricardo. Thanks for that. Ahmed, Steve, Kirsten, I don't know if you wanted to come in with anything additional.
Hi, Kim. I thank you, Ricardo. It was very clear, and I think that the message that we can say that disability is a cross-cutting issue. It's not related to one cluster or one sector. It's related to all cluster and all sector. And every sector should include disability in its humanitarian need review that they are doing in their section. And later on, as Ricardo was saying, to its planning, sectorial strategy and goals at strategic and at operational level, and even at project level. And at this level, really, we need the disaggregated data. We need the specific answer of the question. One of the questions that have been answered about to which extent, and again, to which extent, and how we can ensure that disability is included in the monitoring of the response. And again, here is one of the answers. The cluster, in every cluster, we need have a twin-track approach, specific action that is focusing on disability when needed, and including disability in all the mainstream action, whatever is the cluster is. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ahmed. So we are just about out of time. I'll ask any of you who have any last questions to please quickly post them. And in the interim, Ahmed, there is another question coming in from Deborah. If there is another session planned, and if there is a vision for further utilizing the exercise that was done as a follow-on to Module 1.
Actually, Module 2 was the last module in this package. We have Module 1 and Module 2, but we will, in cooperation with our other colleague, with OCHA and other agency, and of course with the reference group, advisory group, there are a lot of actors working in disability. There will be several modules and webinar in the coming months focusing on HNO, HRP. So of course we will try as our best to share with you all this opportunity if it's related to HNO, HRP. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. So I'm not seeing any other questions coming through. Allow me to take a moment to please complete the very short, less than 10 minutes Survey Monkey to give us a sense of your thoughts of this today. And I'll take a moment to thank our facilitators who also developed the content and put quite a bit of time and effort into this. Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you, Kirsten, Steve, Ricardo. And thanks to all of you for taking time from your days to dedicate to this. Thanks a lot. I wish everyone a good evening, afternoon, depending on where you are.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was very helpful.
Very useful.